Thanks for coming. Nice to see everybody. I have to say, it does feel a little odd to be in public in a space with people. I haven't done this in a long time. I'm sure some of you haven't as well, so I'm trying to get used to that again. My name's Dave Smith. For those of you who don't know me, I'm happy to be here, to be in Tulsa. I've always wanted to come to Tulsa. I think it's a great town. I've been to Oklahoma City a couple times. And tonight I'm going to talk about, I think the title of the talk is The Dharma of Addiction. So what does that mean? What does that look like? And to really zoom out, really what I want to talk about, and we can explore and practice together and have some discussion around it, is the idea of Buddhist recovery, or how would you use Buddhism as a means to recover or to overcome addiction, or however you think of those. And also to point out the fact that this is not new. Many Buddhist centers around the country, Zen centers and Shambhala centers and Tibetan and Theravada Buddhist centers, have been having Buddhist recovery groups for decades. Although it's been, in recent years, it's been popularized to some degree. And some of that has to do with the fact that mindfulness practice is very popular and also very well respected and used in mental health. And so it's a good time, I think, for this practice. But again, it's a little bit strange being in a room with folks, especially strangers. So I always feel a little bit obligated to say a little bit about myself, especially being in recovery for as long as I have. I'm so used to telling my story and connecting with people in a 12-step sense. So my name is Dave Smith, and I'm an addict and an alcoholic, first and foremost. And I really got sober and clean in the 12-step program, primarily Alcoholics Anonymous. But my path has been very, very nonlinear, because I started practicing Buddhism and doing Dharma practice 10 years before I got sober. So I was one of these only person in the early 90s who was 19, 20, 21, sitting at retreats at the Insight Meditation Society. And a lot of times when I would be doing walking meditation, somebody would come out of the office and they would think that I was somebody's kid. And they're like, "Can I help you?" And I'm like, I don't think so. I think I'm okay. And it was really strange. I was the youngest person at IMS for years and years and years. And I would do this. I also played music, and I played in bands, and I did drugs, and I sold drugs, and I drank a lot, and I partied a lot. And I kind of did both, which I totally don't recommend that you try. So I would sit 10-day Vipassana retreats, and then I would go and I would drink and I would party. Then I would sit these 10-day Vipassana retreats. And I always knew there was something about this practice that was meaningful and transformative, but I could never really quite commit. So I was really confused about a lot of this stuff for a long time. And also I have to add and remember to say that, and I'll talk about this more, but part of what I've come to realize in recent years, part of my addiction was really actually fueled by trauma, or PTSD, or complex trauma, was I think actually my addiction was just a response to that. Which I think in a lot of ways it is. I think addiction is just a response to suffering. And when we find that life is too hard, too difficult, too challenging, if we find something that's going to work to alleviate that, of course, that's what we're going to do. And I think our culture does a really bad job of demonizing addiction. And there's a big stigma with addiction. And in fact, if you're a drug addict, you're much more likely to go to prison than you are to go to professional drug treatment. In fact, that's what free treatment in America looks like, is incarceration. I want to stay a little bit out of that because that's a big rabbit hole, but I think that it just makes me sad to think about that. That's more likely the case, is that you get incarcerated rather than getting help. Fortunately for me, I never had to do that. But a couple things happened, I think, early on that were really, really helpful to me. And the first one was when I was 18, I went to the Insight Meditation Society and met with my first Dharma teacher, mostly because I was fortunate enough to grow up down the street from Daniel Goleman. Many of you maybe know Daniel Goleman as the emotional intelligence writer. I grew up down the street from him, and I played with his children. Basically, his children were my friends. And I think in my friend Hanuman, his son, and his mom, they kind of knew something was up with me. And they recommended that I go talk to a Dharma teacher, which I had no idea what that was. But if I thought that might help me, I was willing to do that. And I had a meeting with a teacher named Stephen Smith, who lives in Thailand and has been teaching in Asia for decades. And one thing that he did early on that really helped me was he normalized, for lack of a better word, suffering in a very real way. Because I had been through some traumatic experiences. I had a lot of death and a lot of loss in my early life. That really, my sister was killed in a car accident. I had a girlfriend who was killed in a car accident. I had all these death experiences early on, and nobody really actually ever talked to me about it. So, my sister gets killed in a car accident, big traumatic event, funeral, the whole thing. And then like I'm back in sixth grade, like 10 days later, like trying to learn algebra or whatever. And so I never adjusted from that. So no big surprise that I found drugs and alcohol pretty quick after that and found that to be very helpful actually. But he normalized it in the sense of like, yeah, this is a real thing. Like people suffer in pretty profound ways and people go through some really, really hard stuff. And in our culture, our society, we really don't talk about that. And so it gave me a tremendous relief. And he actually even spoke to the reality that the Buddha, these teachings of the Dharma are these ancient teachings that really actually normalize and recognize the reality of loss and hardship and pain and all the things in life that we really struggle with, mostly I think in the privacy of our own minds. They're not really great topics to bring up at a casual dinner party. But I think that all of us in some way or another, we struggle with that kind of in the backstage of our own minds. We think about it too much. We don't talk about it. And we maybe learn to live with it. Knowing the whole time that we're kind of walking around with a rock in our shoe. And everybody's walking around with a rock in their shoe, but everybody's pretending like they're totally fine. And so that was really helpful to me to get that kind of initial, what we'd call a Dharma transmission, an understanding of like, oh, okay. And then immediately after that, the same day, I learned mindfulness practice. And, this practice, which we'll do a couple of these this evening, this most fundamental practice that we probably all know that I've taken for granted, where you pay attention to your breathing, you pay attention to your body, and you stay with that experience, and then you notice your mind wanders, right? And then you bring the attention back to the breath. And that's kind of what you do, right? But at 18, when I did that, it completely blew my mind. It changed my whole worldview because I started to see that all of the confusion and all of the fear and all of the self-hatred and all of the ways in which I thought the world was a horrible place were really just ideas and thoughts in my own mind. And I noticed I could see that happening and I could get caught up in that and I could let it go and I could come back to my body or come back to my breath and then all that would just be gone. So there was almost like there was an exit door. I was like, oh, you mean you can get out of here and be somewhere else? Because I just lived in my mind. I was so identified with my mind at that point that whatever happened in my mind, whatever I thought, whatever I felt, I just assumed was real and true, and that was the kind of world that I lived in. And I could tell you, I have got so much relief. If that's all I've gotten out of this, I'm totally happy. And it wasn't enough. And I continued to drink and use and do things that were against my sense of value. But I got enough from that initial experience to really kind of acclimate to the world. And I think actually in that first encounter, something went away, something happened, something shifted. Probably an intensity of suffering that I was experiencing never actually really came back. And that was enough, that experience, that seed, whatever that was enough to plant the seed in my mind to go, I might want to revisit this later. There's something going on here that when I'm done playing the parties and playing the gigs and squeezing all the hedonic pleasure I can out of the world, maybe I'll come back to this. And then, fast forward 10 years later, I, bottomed out on drugs and alcohol and playing in a band and trying to have success and came back to that. But I didn't come back to the Dharma. I actually came to Alcoholics Anonymous, which is really what I needed. And then I did that for 4 or 5 years. I still do that. It's been 18 years now. But then I started to kind of blend these two. And one thing that I want to say, and we'll do a practice on this, that I really want to put in the room that I think is really important is in American Buddhism, for lack of a better word, doesn't get the attention it deserves. But really at the heart, I think, of the Buddhist tradition, all the Buddhist traditions, and I think really at the heart of recovery is a sense of goodness, or what we say in Dharma, sila. Sila sort of means goodness or integrity, or really what I think is just actually having a sense of integrity to your own values, whatever your values are. So in Dharma, we have to be careful we don't try to subscribe to some list of like, these are the values you should have. That's part of it. But part of it is to actually reflect and to say, well, what are my values? Honesty, sense of loyalty, generosity, kindness. What are my values? And in which ways do I express to the world that what my values are? So that when you meet me and you spend time with me, you know what my values are. I don't have to tell you because you see how I live. And to me, that's really what integrity is. That's what sila is. And so we've become, American Buddhism, again, for lack of a better word, has become very preoccupied with the intellectual side of things, the wisdom side of things, the knowledge side of things, to know, to know things as they truly are, or to understand the ultimate nature of reality, or these kind of ideas, which are very attractive. But I think something gets lost in the shuffle when we start to think of it that way. And I really learned integrity and sila much more in my early 12-step days than I did in my Dharma practice. Not because Dharma practice didn't say it, but in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, it was black and white in a good way. It's like, yeah, don't lie, don't steal, be honest, get in touch with your sense of values. And I really needed that. And I got a lot out of that. And so I'm really grateful for that kind of approach to living. Because I don't know about you, when I'm living in line with my sense of values, I'm pretty happy. I like myself. I like the world. I do well. We all do well when we're in line. When our values and our intentions and our actions and our speech are congruent, we actually thrive. And when it's not congruent, we don't do so good. And so if you're drinking and doing drugs and living that kind of life, it's kind of impossible to do that. And then we get cut off from that. And so there's this kind of, I think that the most important thing is this, it's really kind of the fertile ground that we build the life of recovery out of, we build a Dharma practice out of that. One of the ways that the Buddha talks about the mind or the heart or kind of developing this practice is he uses the analogy of cultivation, of seed and fruit, and soil and light and water. And how do things actually grow? How do things flourish? And the reason he uses this language is that's the world that he grew up in. In ancient India, he grew up in an agricultural society. His family were farmers. He would have been very aware that there was this idea of there's a seed, and if you take a seed and you put it in fertile dirt and you pay attention to it and you take care of it and you tend to it and you water it and you give it light, it will actually blossom and bloom into a fruit that you can eat, that you can use to nourish yourself with. And I think the theory is that he saw that in the external world. He said, oh, I wonder if that's actually true for the mind. I wonder if that's true for the inner life. Does the same analogy work? And it's a great analogy because it's so easy to understand. It's not that esoteric. You all probably have grown a garden or something at one point, and you're like, wow, I bought these little seeds at the store that look like rocks, and then a couple months later I had a delicious tomato. Like, that's pretty cool. And does that actually happen for the internal life of the mind, of the heart, of behavior? And it does. But what kind of soil are we growing our minds and hearts in? And so that soil is really sila. It's kind of a sense of goodness, wanting to be a good person, wanting to have positive change in the world. And I think when I reflect on what are the things that motivated me to get sober, and I think this is true for a lot of people, I've had this conversation with many people, it's this recognition, like, I want to be a good person. I want to treat people better. I want to treat myself better. And it'd be nice if I could contribute to the world and to other people in a kind of a meaningful way. And that's a really great motivation to do anything. And I think if we look around now, now's a really great time to start doing that kind of stuff. So the first practice I want to offer this evening is a practice of sila, which you probably haven't done before. It's not usually taught as a meditation practice, which I find to be odd. It's usually taught as kind of a precept or a training, or which I haven't found to be that helpful, frankly. First of all, I'm a drug addict and alcoholic, and the last thing I like is to be told what to do. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I really don't like people telling me what to do. I don't even like it when the lady at the airport tells me to put the seatbelt on. I don't know what it is about me, but I'm just like, and I'm happy to put my seatbelt on, but just don't tell me to do it. I'll get to it when I'm ready. Right, so this is an ongoing theme for me. And so I think this intentionality, this seal of this good, it really is better if it comes inside out. So cultivating it as a practice is really kind of rich. So we'll maybe take about 10 or 15 minutes. So we'll do a guided practice here on Sila. I'll walk you through it. And you can let yourself find a comfortable way to sit. And I'll start and end with the bell. Thank you. And to just say a few more words about that I think are interesting is in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, I've been very interested and to some degree obsessed with trying to uncover the historic Buddha as not so much a religious figure, but actually as a person who lived in the world, no different than anybody here, really, and what would have shaped his ideas. And I think largely what has shaped his ideas is this sense of agriculture, of cultivation, of there being seeds and there being fruits and there being a process that carries the seed to the fruit. And if that's true in the external world, then clearly it must be true in here. And there's, almost a 3,000-year-old tradition that's saying that's the case. But when you think about also, he was a tribe, he grew up in a tribal community. Some people we hear of the Buddha, we hear the story of him growing up in this elaborate palace and he was sheltered from the world. And it's kind of actually quite a nice story. If you watch the PBS documentary on the Buddha, you get this story. But the fact of the matter is there actually were no palaces in ancient India. They didn't have glass, they didn't have metal, they didn't even have bricks. So the truth of the matter is he probably grew up in a pretty elaborate wood structure. And he was his clan his tribal community was called the Sakyans, which meant like worshipers of the sun. So they would have been like a tribal. They would have been much more like native indigenous people, and they were sun worshipers. And when I think about the sun, it reminds me of two things: that the sun provides light and warmth, right? And the sun really provides life for the planet. And the light represents wisdom. It represents clear seeing. The sun is what allows us to see. And it represents wisdom, and it's how we can see ourselves and we can see the world and we can see the relationship we have to ourselves and the world with more clarity, with more insight, with more understanding. It also provides warmth, which is the warmth of the heart, the warmth of compassion, the warmth of kindness, the warmth of caring. And so if he grew up with this kind of thinking, it just makes a lot of sense that most of his ideas and his teachings would have been formed under this notion. And so the other thing I think so I want to talk mostly about the Dharma and kind of put Buddhism politely aside, because I actually love Buddhism. I'm sort of a Buddhist fanatic. I'm obsessed with Buddhism and I love it. But I think like a lot of things, it carries a lot of extra stuff that's actually quite confusing. So I always like to politely put that aside and say, well, what is the Dharma? Because the Buddha didn't teach Buddhism. He taught the Dharma. And so, well, what is that? And what's the difference? And so when we think about the Dharma as a system, as kind of the agricultural system, the process which takes the seed from the seed and turns it into the fruit, it's a really complicated system. It's actually not that simple. But when I think about it in terms of addiction, and I think that our understanding of addiction in our culture is really not very sophisticated. And when we think of people who have addiction, we really look at it in a very derogatory kind of way. This is changing, thankfully. I think that's a good thing. But historically, we sort of think of addiction as a bad thing, and people who are addicts are sort of bad people who make bad choices and do terrible things, and who kind of should know better, right? Which is really a very destructive way to look at it. If you look at it from the view of the Dharma or from the Buddhist teachings, one of the things that people get confused is they think that the Dharma is a teaching on causality, like cause and effect. There's a cause and there's an effect, and if there's an effect, get rid of the cause, get rid of the problem. That's kind of how our society and our Western minds work. But really, it's much more about interdependence. And there's actually a doctor from Vancouver named Dr. Gabor Mate who talks about addiction in this way, where he doesn't say, why do people become addicted? But why are people in so much pain? And it's not what causes addiction. That's always the question. I went to addiction conferences for years, and I'm so tired of hearing everybody's theory about what causes addiction. Nothing really causes it, but it's what's it dependent upon? It has to be something underneath. There's something going on that is happening, that the addiction can't arise in a vacuum. It has to have some sort of source, right? Everything has to have some sort of source. And so when we look at the most fundamental Dharma idea, that's a very confused idea, I think. It's this idea which is standardly known as the First Noble Truth, the truth of dukkha, often translated as suffering, which isn't a great translation, frankly. But there's actually something, you might have noticed this, inherently difficult about being a human being. Like, just being here, just having a mind and a body and a nervous system and experiences that don't go your way, and things happen that you don't want to happen, and things that you think are going to happen don't happen, and we lose things, and in the end we lose it all. And we get things that we don't want, and that in and of itself is really, really hard. And the reason I like the Sila practice so much is actually another thing that can get it kind of a derogatory term in the Dharma is this idea of desire, which is really kind of the natural movement of the heart. That's kind of how everything works in our system, is we kind of have a desire for something. And desire is considered ethically neutral in the Buddhist system. It's not good or bad, or it's just there. And that we actually have some desires that are totally appropriate and good, and some that maybe aren't so much. But what happens is when we lose big ticket items, or when we start to get pain around the things that we want and we don't get those, or we get things that we really don't want, we have loss and traumatic events, that kind of pain is what the addiction lives on. It's what it feeds on. It needs that to arise. So it's not so much cause and effect. It's more about how do things come into being. The term cultivation, which is the Buddhist real term for meditation, we use the word meditation a lot, but that's a much later idea. That actually didn't come around until about the 1700s. But in early Buddhist tradition, it was really to cultivate. And that is how do you take something that's not there and bring it into being? And we can bring some really beautiful, wonderful things into being, and we can bring some not so good things into being. We go to our garden and we have tomatoes and broccoli and peppers, and we have the weeds, and if you go to a garden, it's kind of a combination of the two, isn't it? You can't really have one without the other. So we have to kind of work at this stuff. And so when we start to see that this addiction rises out of it, so it's not like, well, why do people become addicted and what causes addiction? What's there to begin with is there's something happening that hurts. And if we can't be with that or understand that or heal that or whatever, then the addiction comes in, or what we would say tanha, craving, reactivity, comes in and says, hey man, you don't have to feel like this. And then we discover things when we're young that we do in that experience that alleviate that. When a little kid has a lollipop or watches a nice show, or and this isn't bad or wrong. This is totally fine to do this. Addiction is really, actually, to me, just when you start to look at it from this perspective, it just makes a lot of sense. Of course, this is what we do. If you can medicate your pain, of course you should medicate your pain. But it kind of can get a little bit out of control, right? And so you could actually say, in a nicer way, you could say addiction is really just self-medication. It's to alleviate ourselves. And what it turns into, there's actually a Buddhist teaching that I really like called the wound that seeks the arrow. Think about that for a second. Why would the wound seek the arrow? And so we have these pain installations, we have these difficult experiences in our life that hurt so much that we move through the world, we posture through the world afraid that it might happen again, or we try to protect ourselves in ways that just you can't do it. And when we start to get these symptoms or these things that we can do that alleviate that, of course that's what you're going to do. Right? And then when you look at the research, or you look at people who have addiction, who have really severe addiction, whether it's methamphetamine, alcohol, cocaine, like really hardcore substance abuse addiction, when you start to look at their life's experience, and this also comes from the work of Gabor Mate, he says it's always about trauma. I don't think it's always about trauma, but most people who have severe addictions, when you look at their life, you're like, wow, some really horrible stuff happened to you when you were young. It's almost, the percentage is very high. It's 85% or more anyway. And it's actually, when you start to look at it that way, it's not that confusing why they ended up doing what they ended up doing, because it was unmanageable. And so a lot of times, in the way that sometimes the Buddhist teachings can get it backwards, where people think that the craving or the addiction caused the pain. Craving causes suffering, which is a little bit, I don't quite necessarily understand how that works. But it's my inability to deal with my experience that actually gave rise to that addiction, to that craving, that wanting things to be different. Have you ever been in a moment of time where you wanted things to be different? Like 15 times today, right? And that's fundamentally the recipe for disaster that we get into. We don't want things to be the way that they are. We want things to be different. We wish that this didn't happen. We wish it did happen. And we start to get cut off from our experience and imagine how much better our life would be if these things hadn't happened, and how unfair that is, and how much I wish it wasn't like that. And then that becomes more and more painful, and now I need to continue to medicate myself from that. And this is happening to everybody. So from a Dharma perspective, addiction not only makes a lot of sense, but to some degree, everybody's addicted to something. Whether it's I'm addicted to my phone, I'll be honest with you. I look at my phone way more than I need to, And a lot of times I look at my phone because I'm feeling uncomfortable in the present moment. I'm at lunch with somebody and they get up to go to the bathroom and I'm sitting at the table by myself and I have to look at my phone because I'm by myself in a restaurant and that's like too hard or something, right? But again, that's not a problem. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's where it starts. That's where it kind of comes into being. So one of the things that I think is interesting is that in recent years, lots of people have been trying to develop Buddhist recovery type of programs, and they've been kind of reorganizing the teachings in a different way to make it fit. But actually, I find if I go way, way back and I just look at what was in the original message in the original teachings, I see a completely, totally, perfectly designed program for overcoming addiction. And I don't need to add it or change it or elaborate on it. It's just all really right there. And in fact, the teachings of the second noble truth, so the first noble truth is that life is hard, life is painful. We all know that. We don't like it so much, but if we're honest, we know it's true. And that's not a problem. The Buddha actually doesn't even speak about that in a derogatory way. In America and our Western cultures, we sort of say, oh, the first noble truth is sort of the bad news about life. But the Buddha never speaks about dukkha or the first truth as being bad or wrong. He never speaks about it in a derogatory tone. He just says that this is kind of how it is, which is a terrible marketing campaign for a religion, frankly, right? That's why there's only 18 people here. But what he's saying is that really that the teachings of the second noble truth, which is usually translated as craving, but really tanha, and a lot of these words are hard to translate, but really reactivity arises out of that. And I've talked with Buddhist scholars about this, and I believe the entire teachings of the second noble truth is really just all about addiction. Addicted to people, places, things, phones, addicted to wanting things to be different, just that kind of the suffering that I experience when I just can't be here, right? From a very, very, very subtle feeling of like it's a little too hot out, or the air conditioning is a little too cold, or the slightest irritation, to the full-blown intolerable thing. All of that kind of reaction to that is really what addiction is. And even the word addiction has such a kind of strong term to it. But you know, there's all these terms that mean something. Like there's tanha, there's reactivity, there's things that they call hindrances, there's things they call defilements, there's greed, hatred, confusion. If you start looking at Buddhism and Dharma practice, you'll start to see that they're really fond of their lists. But all of the lists associated with the second, known as the second noble truth, are really kind of all about addiction. And so the goal, of course, is to recognize and to overcome that, not to get rid of it. Right? To come to terms with that, and to just kind of own that, and to understand that even if we look at modern science and neuroscience, is that we're hardwired for this stuff. And the other thing that's really important here, I think that's been very important to me, is that I have to be careful that I don't start thinking that I'm bad or wrong for this process that I was born into, that I inherited. The Buddha doesn't do this moralistic finger wagging at us. He really doesn't. He's not interested in that, but much more interested in can you care about that? Can you forgive yourself for that? Can you just understand that that is what you're up against? That's a big system to go up against. And of course, that's not how we view it in our culture. That's not the attitude. That's not the perspective. And so the other thing that's interesting, I find, is if you look at us, who are, I don't think there's any monastics here, is that when you look at the early Buddhist teachings and you look at the early canon, you look at what's in there, I think there's two Dharma paths that are being offered. One of them is the one that we probably mostly know about, which is the Dharma path of becoming a Buddhist monk or a Buddhist nun, which is, following a strict code of conduct and joining the monastery, which the world has been doing for a long time. And I'm so glad that people have done that. I'm so grateful that we've inherited those traditions. But there's also this other teaching, I think, that's been long forgotten, where in the early tradition, in the time of the Buddha, there was a lot of people who were not monastics. Sometimes they call them lay practitioners or householders. I just say non-monastic because it's a lot easier. That there was actually a Dharma path. There was a path of practice that was for both. And that one kind of got disappeared probably maybe before the Buddha died or soon after that. And then Buddhism, the Dharma, turned into a kind of a world religion that was really refined and restored and held into the monastic world. And even in Asian countries, most of the lay people, the village people, they support the monks in the monastery, which I think is awesome. I love that they do that. I think that's so great. But what about the rest of us? How do we kind of do this? If you wanted to live a Dharma-informed life or a Buddhist practice life, how do we do that in terms of relationships and sexuality and taxes and politics and all of the dukkha that we have, which is a lot, right? I don't know about you, but my life is full of external demands that the monks, fortunately, don't have to really deal with that. That's why they do it. And so what happened is it got broken into these two ideas, and the Buddhist term is vimutti, which is a translation of liberation. So we could largely say that Dharma practice is the practice of liberating ourselves from suffering, or liberating ourselves into having a meaningful life, into having a good life, into being the people that we aspire to be, right? And one of that is liberation through wisdom, which is panya vimutti, which is this idea that we're going to understand. And if we just understood things properly, correctly, wisely, that we wouldn't suffer so much, which is probably true. But in our culture, because we're such an education and intellectual knowledge kind of culture, that we have reduced it largely to wisdom being about knowing something. And people come into the Buddhist center, they come into the meditation class, and we feel like there's something that we don't know. And if we knew what it was, we wouldn't suffer anymore. We want that knowledge. We want that teaching. We want that, whatever that is, whatever you think that is, that there's something that you need to know. And then we think that Dharma practice is this kind of knowledge having thing. And if I just had the right information, life would be easier or something like that. Are you familiar with this? I don't think that's gonna, I've tried that. I've had very little success so far. But it's really actually not knowing that, it's knowing how, which is another liberation practice, which is called Chitta Vimutti, which is actually not liberation through wisdom, but liberation through the heart. Liberation through compassion, liberation through not understanding the world, but liberation through how we are relating to the world. Not knowing something enough so we don't suffer anymore, but actually being in the messy mix of all of this, which is probably what most of us have noticed we've been up to. We're kind of in the messy mix of this life. And all the knowledge and all the list learning and all of the stuff in the world may or may not be all that helpful. Right? And so we're seeing this kind of reemerge, mostly because people, I can't even say the West anymore, because people all over the world are doing this. In modernity, the academics call it, that there are a lot of people, or maybe people in this room, certainly myself, who are really interested in trying to take this Dharma practice on and saying like, yeah, I understand this makes sense, I'm doing this, I want to do this, but I'm not 100% sure what it is I'm supposed to be doing, or supposed to be knowing, more likely, right? And then that becomes a kind of, we become wisdom obsessed. And we don't really meditate or go retreats or go practice, but we sure listen to our fair share of podcasts on mindfulness and Buddhism, and this guy says this and that guy said that. And, I'm not going to meditate today, but I'm going to listen to a podcast on mindfulness because there's 500 million of them, which is fine, right? I do that, but I can sometimes miss out on the bigger picture here. And that is that another reframe that you might find helpful, that I find to be helpful, is this idea that, they say that craving causes suffering, which it certainly does sometimes. But I think that misses the bigger point where this tanha, this addiction, this reactivity, it's not so much that it causes me suffering, but it's blocking me. It's keeping me from being the person that I want to be. It's keeping me from doing the things that I want to do. It's keeping me from actually living truly in line with my sense of values, with my sense of purpose. It's getting in the way. It's a hindrance. And it's called that in one of the teachings of mindfulness. They're called the 5 hindrances. And so it's not so much that there's this thing, and we're so, also in Buddhism, American Buddhism, we're suffering obsessed. Right? We want to get to the end of the suffering. When is the end of the suffering going to happen? And I don't think it is. But what does the heavier lifting for me is, well, what's getting in the way of me why am I having a hard time? Why am I unable to fulfill the desires? How come I'm not able to follow through with the things that I would like to follow through with? What's blocking me? And that actually steers us more into an optimistic view, right? Because trying to get to the end of suffering or trying to get in this causation thing just keeps us in it, actually. And as they say in the neuroscience world, whatever you pay attention to gets bigger. Have you noticed that? Whatever you pay attention to gets bigger and bigger. It's the snowball, the proverbial snowball rolling down the hill. It was this big, and now it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So just by becoming suffering focused or suffering obsessed, we just kind of stay in that part of the practice. And then we get upset about that. Sometimes people say it to me, like, I've been practicing Buddhism for 18 years and I'm still suffering. I'm like, good for you. Me too. I'm getting good at it though. Right? It's not that bad. And then I'm like, well, in what ways in my life am I thriving? Where am I excelling? Where am I doing well? And sometimes we don't focus on that. We don't think about that so much. We're so focused on what we're not doing right. God forbid you turn on the news channel. It's like the whole culture we live in is all a message of how things are not going well. And whose fault is it? Right? And of course, in the neuroscience, whatever you pay attention to gets bigger, but also in the meditative world, attention training, it's like we become caught in this negative attention bias, which is really kind of another kind of an addiction, which is the hatred side of it. Tanha, meaning greed, hatred, and confusion. It's that obsession with the negativity, that why is it like this, and how come it's like that, and who did it, and how can we fix it, and how can we change, and how can we control. One of the definitions for addiction that I like, that was blended from Gabor Mate and also the Noah Levine book called Refuge Recovery, that says addiction, its attempt, what it's trying to do is trying to avoid, change, or control something about the present moment that seems unbearable or unacceptable. And if I can't fix it, I'm going to try to change it. And if I can't change it, you better believe I'm going to control it. And that's that kind of negativity, kind of bias we get pulled into, and we become obsessed, we cling, we become addicted, we become fixated on that. When there's 500 other things we could be paying attention to, frankly. And then we get kind of locked into that. And that's a kind of a psychological kind of an addiction. Right? And who said the moment was unbearable anyway? I did. Unacceptable. This shouldn't be happening. Right? And the problem with this is it actually works. And the trade-off is, the scam here is, you get immediate relief from that. It gives you some relief. You get short-term relief, but it creates long-term harm and consequences. It's like going to Best Buy and buying a flat screen TV on a credit card with 50% APR financing. You can put the TV in the car right now and drive home and watch it, but you will pay for it later, and you will pay handsomely for it. But mostly we say, fine, cool, put it in, load it up. I'll take the relief now. We bet on that. Of course, we know better. We know what's happening. We know we're playing the losing hand. But this is why I think it's so hard. Is that I know that for me, when I'm in a difficult moment in my life, and I can understand there's a little short-term scam, there's something that I could do here to make this easier. What do I do there? Do I decide to say, no, I'm going to choose the dukkha? I'm going to choose to have this moment be hard. I'm going to choose to have this conflict in my relationship be hard. I'm going to choose the harder thing, knowing that that's actually in the long run going to be better for me. Who wants to do that? That's a terrible marketing campaign, right? But that's really kind of what we're up against. And this is why, if you look at, and even now, I mean, in the last month, I've had two friends pretty close to me. One of them was a student, one of them was an older student, who both OD'd and died. In the time of COVID, drug addiction has gone through the roof. Addiction has gone through the roof. We don't hear that because we have so much other terrible news to hear. They can't get to all the bad news, folks. They only have an hour. We can't possibly cover it all, but we're going to try. We will try to inform you of all the horrible things happening in the world in which you have no control over. It's also known as the news, right? And so, I actually was very affected by one of the deaths because one of them was a student who I had talked to a couple of days before. But I've been clean and sober and in recovery and in this kind of Dharma work for so long that I actually kind of forgot. I kind of want to forget. I kind of want to be in denial about that. I'm like, oh, people are doing fine. It's like, no, they're not. There's still a lot of people who really, really struggle with this. And the thing about Dharma and the 12 steps, one of the things that's different between those, that I think is an important distinction to make, is that the 12 steps, which I love the 12 steps, I've saved my life, but there's a focus on symptomology. And what I mean by that, there's a focus on the particular object or behavior in which I'm addicted to. And that's why there's like 47 different 12-step meetings. There's 12 steps for drugs, for alcohol, for sex, for gambling, for food, for people. Like anything you can become addicted. That's why there's like a new 12-step program every year, because they're like, hey, guess what people are getting? There's going to be a cell phone anonymous meeting, I'm sure, soon enough. Which is fine, but the problem is when we go to Dharma practice, we take it one step further and we recognize it has nothing to do, the object in which I'm addicted to is frankly irrelevant. You know, some people get their relief from drinking, some get it from shopping, some get it from sex, some get it from the lack of sex, some get it from overeating, some get it from undereating. It doesn't really matter what you're getting it from. That's a kind of distraction. The fact of the matter, and the more important thing, is that there's something going on inside of you that's, what is it that's driving me to that object? What is it that's driving me to that behavior? And we see what happens too, as they like to say in the 12 steps, which I think is funny, is people oftentimes trade seats on the Titanic. And they go, okay, well, my problem is cocaine. I got to stop doing cocaine. I'm just going to drink whiskey and alcohol. Actually, the whiskey is a problem. I need to drop the whiskey. I'm just going to drink beer. Actually, you know what? The beer is kind of a problem. I'm just going to smoke weed. And they just kind of go down to the next thing and not realizing that it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the fact that there's something going on inside of me that I can't tolerate, that I hate, that I want to be different. And we'll just keep playing that Russian roulette. And sometimes it's, harm reduction's okay, right? It's better to probably eat too much sugar than to smoke too much crack, but you're also missing kind of the undertone of that. And what that is you're missing out on the fact that there's something either you're not seeing because you're in denial, or it's too painful, or you don't really want to see, which is in Buddhism what they call ignorance, which I think is kind of too derogatory. But it just means that there's something going on, and you probably know this, I deal with this every day in my life. I'm kind of choosing to ignore. I don't actually want to know about this. I don't want to know why I eat 1,000 more calories a day than I actually do. I don't really. I need that. Don't take away. You take away everything else. Now they're coming from my carbs and my sugar, right? And that's part of it. But it's in your best interest. It's in our interest for all of us to really kind of want to know what's going on there, what's driving that. And so we don't want to, but one way to think about this, and of course there's many ways to think about it. There's many different ways you can look at Dharma perspectives. This is just kind of one of them, but is looking at this liberation through chitta, or chitta vimutti. Is that for many of us, I find that you'll find that the liberation you're looking for is going to come through your relationship to the world, not through understanding how the world works or how the nature of reality, as a lot of the Buddhist ideas are rooted in. If I just understood things clearly, I wouldn't suffer. But actually, it's much more about my relationship to what's happening than trying to just understand what's happening. Because part of understanding what's happening is understanding there's a lot of things that are happening that I can't fix, change, control, avoid. And I need to come into relationship with that in a way that doesn't cause harm to myself, that doesn't cause harm to others, that has more things like loving kindness or metta, or a kinder, accepting, cooperative relationship towards things. That has a relationship that's more compassionate. That can say, oh man, this really hurts. This really, really still hurts. This is probably always going to hurt a little bit. And can I meet that with a kind of more of a care rather than a aversion? And gratitude and appreciation, being able to, and I think you have to work hard. I think compassion and kindness are hard. I think actually gratitude, which sounds more positive, right, is really one of the hardest ones to, and this comes from the clinical work I do around, one of the things I'm obsessed with all kinds of things, but one of the things I've been obsessed with in the last 5 years is happiness research. Did you know there's people out there whose jobs is to research happiness? If I could go back and do it again, that's what I would have done. I would have become a happiness researcher, where you go into the laboratory every day and you study happiness. That must be so cool. But the happiness researchers say that happiness is it's not about getting what you want, which is generally what we think. If I can get the things that I want, then I'll be happy. You know this formula? It's about wanting what you have. Actually wanting the things that you have, that you already have. Because we get the things that we want, and then what do? Then you want something else. I see that I have a 2-year-old and an 8-year-old. I see this is totally the best Dharma teaching because I see it every day. I had this image as my son Coyote's 2.5, and he was, we were somewhere, and there were some cookies on like a tray, and he grabbed the cookie with his left hand, and he grabbed the cookie with his right hand, and he had a cookie in each hand, and he was looking at the tray of cookies, and he couldn't take it. He was just like, he couldn't deal with that because he wanted he didn't have another hand, and he's just like, I'm like, dude, you don't even have it in your mouth yet. But he's two. He does. That's just how we're wired. We're like, I got what I wanted. I got what I wanted. Okay, keep it coming. Keep it coming. And we never get we never actually enjoy the thing that we thought we'd be so happy when we got. So this idea that happiness is about getting what you want, do you have any evidence? You probably have some evidence to suggest that that's true. But what about the experiences when you actually really embrace and you really connect with and you really actually enjoy in a present moment kind of way this thing that I have, whether it's my children or even my TV or my dog or my guitar or my back porch with a chair, that whatever it is. You probably have tons of things in your life right now that you actually enjoy, but do you actually take the time to sit down and enjoy them? I have to work pretty hard at that. I have to remember, I have to recognize, I have to actually put, to be honest with you, I'm a little disappointed with the amount of effort I actually have to put into doing that, because I forget. You know, the chair, this is kind of an old chair, and all of a sudden everything, I don't like any of the stuff I have. I want new stuff, better stuff, more comfortable stuff. Car's not fast enough, the TV's not big enough, the French fries aren't salty enough. You know, that kind of, So I think learning how to want what we have is so crucial. So I don't want to talk the whole time because I can, but I want to do another practice with you, another mindfulness practice, really actually a Chitta Vimutti practice, which another way to say that is a Metta Vipassana practice, which is integrating the foundations of mindfulness with the Brahma Viharas or the kindness, compassion, gratitude, equanimity, and actually doing those as a singular practice. So I'll walk you through that. We'll do that maybe for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have some questions and answers, and I think that will be about it. Does that sound all right? Yeah? So you can begin by finding a comfortable, upright way to sit. We'll start and end with the bell. Recovery seems to be a very important part of the equation here. What are some words or some terminology or some Buddhist ideas that would mean something like recovery? And there's actually quite a few, I think, and they're big ticket items. And the first one I want to mention is the word that's strongly associated with the third noble truth, which is nibbana or nirvana. You probably hear this word nirvana all the time in a Buddhist context, and I think it's a largely misunderstood word because we oftentimes think that the Eightfold Path, and if we're good Buddhists, it will lead to nirvana. And nirvana has sort of become the Buddhist idea of heaven. Nibbana is like Buddhist heaven. And I think that's a little bit backwards because I think that the Buddhist tradition has put Nibbana on such a high pedestal that it almost has become unachievable. And I really believe that actually Nibbana is a word that could be synonymous with recovery. I think that you experience all human beings, whether they're Buddhists or not, or interested in this conversation or not, I think everybody experiences Nibbana many, many, many times every single day. We mostly don't know it. I think that Nibbana is a very, very simple, ordinary mind state. I think it's also equivalent to, like, in science, we use the word homeostasis, which is where our system is in equilibrium, our respiratory system, we're regulated, and we're just kind of okay. And we're okay you're okay a lot of the time, but you don't know that, or you don't recognize that, or you don't bring awareness to that experience. And when you look at a lot of times the teachings of greed, hatred, and confusion, which are just really shorthand for tanha or reactivity, are traditionally known as the three fires. And so the metaphor that the Buddha talks about and associated with addiction is a fire of a kind of burning. The kind of reaction, that kind of metaphor, heat, fire, reaction. Where the Nibbana, the metaphor is coolness. So addiction is kind of fire, recovery is a coolness, which I love that because I think the American term, the English term cool is a great word. We use it all the time. When we meet somebody we like, what do we say? Oh, you got to meet my friend. You'll like this guy. He's super cool. Right? We love people who are cool. It's easy to be around. You're with that person. You love people that are just easy to be around. they're cool. They're non-reactive. They kind of move with a sense of ease. Nibbana, interestingly enough, is an ancient Indian cooking term, which means to remove from the heat. So when you take the cooking pan off of the flame and you put it over here, it cools down. That's a nibbana, the sense of coolness. And I think we all have this kind of nibbanic sensibility that we actually have. That's really an innate property. It kind of came with your equipment. It's like this Buddhist idea that you have to cultivate after all this time. It's right there. There's a teacher who I sat with, who I love, named Ajahn Suchito, who's a Thai forest monk. And he always says, Nibbana is under your nose 24/7, just waiting for you to tap it. But you don't, because you're too busy trying to avoid, change, control, fix, get rid of, have. And it's like literally right there. And we tap into it all the time. Like, oh yeah, that's right. That's mindfulness. Remember to recognize that you're okay as many times a day as you possibly can, even though your mind will talk you out of it. I'm pretty sure I'm not okay right now. My mind loves that one. It's like, you're thinking, you're not. You're actually a total mess, and you know it. Right? So Nibbana, and then also another word, this word equanimity, which is a huge word concept in the Buddhist language. To think about it, that's a little bit of a bummer. The Pali word is upekkha, but equanimity is not a word that you use every day on the street, right? It's usually a word we only hear or learn about in a Buddhist context, which I think is kind of a drag. But equanimity it literally means there in the middleness. It means a posturing. It means that I'm taking all of the resources I have and I'm bringing to this moment, and I'm suspending my expectation about what's going to happen. It's kind of an outcome of mindfulness. It's being here and being okay. Presence and ease, I think, also can be likened to a sense of recovery. To be in equanimity, to be in nibbana. Even the word dharma itself means something like law or nature. That we have this, I like it as nature. Things have a nature to them, a natural way of being. The seed goes in the ground, and if you take care of it, the nature of the seed is actually to be a fruition. So the nature of the mind, there is a natural inclination towards nibbana, a natural inclination towards being awake. It is built in. It's not some magical religious idea. It's just kind of a natural property that we can tap into to this idea of dharma, or of even bodhi, awake, to be awake, to wake up, to be in those experiences. So I think when we think about addiction and recovery, those are some of the ideas that I like to think about. I like to take the Buddhist goal, for lack of a better word, or off the pedestal and bring it down to the ground where it belongs. Because I don't think the Buddha was trying to trick anybody, and I don't think there's anything mystical or magical or unattainable about any of this stuff. I think it's just how we kind of acclimate to that. So the problem is if we think that the goal of the practice is like far down some long mystical road that we may never get to, we're like the picture they see with like the racehorse jockey on the horse. He's trying to get the horse to go faster, so he's got like a little fishing pole and a carrot in front of it, and the horse can only see the carrot. And he's like, and that's how we are. We're racing, we're rushing, we're trying to get to the thing, and we don't realize we're actually holding the stick. Right? So counterintuitive. And that's why there's all this emphasis, and I think with the Buddha, the one direction he's always pointing us to is back to right now. Right here, right now, watching things, how they unfold, how things happen, how can we be right now? And it turns out, I think that it's a lot of work to do that, actually. My mind doesn't like the now setting. I'm always having to readjust, right? And there's this one analogy one of my teachers uses that I like. He talks about getting to a destination, getting to where we want to be. And he uses the analogy of the space shuttle. So in the space shuttle, anytime they send it into outer space, it's off course like 97% of the time. But it always gets to where it's supposed to go because they're having to constantly readjust it. And that's kind of, I think, how our practice is. We're mostly off course, but we have to constantly like, come on, stay. And that's a lot of work, and that's a lot of effort, and that's a lot of diligence, and that's the elbow grease, I think, of the practice, or the elbow grease of recovery, is that remembering to recognize, which I think is the mechanics of mindfulness. Remember to recognize that you're right here. This is where you are. And you're going to have to do that a lot. And then in doing that, the more you remember to recognize, the more you remember to recognize. And the practice, I find, takes on a more natural mode, where everything you're looking for has been here the whole time. We just have to kind of remember that, and not get too far into this, turning the Dharma goal into some kind of Buddhist heaven or some kind of unattainable thing, which, largely the Buddhist religion has kind of done to us. Especially as it's come over here, because, God forbid you remember. I don't know if you remember. There used to be a bookstore called Barnes and Noble before Amazon took everything over. But when you go into the bookstore and you go to the, God forbid you go to look at the Buddhist section. Oh my God, you're done. There's so many different ways of approaching it that it's really complicated. So trying to get back to the simple side of it, to the original message, to the humanity of the practice, and that the big message, I think, is that you're not your fault. The Buddha is really good about not getting into this sort of moralistic finger waving at us. There's none of that. And I think that's really important. And I think a lot of us have, for a whole variety of reasons, have inherited that kind of feeling or that sense. That I think is the ultimate hindrance to meditation practice, which I, as a meditation teacher, I don't just teach Buddhist meditation, but I teach all kinds of meditation. It's the number one thing that people seem to struggle with, is the idea that they're not doing it right. I don't think I'm doing this right, because this is not feeling good. It's not about feeling good. I remember asking a teacher one time, I said, if I do this, am I really going to feel better? He said, yeah, you're going to feel better. You're going to feel shame better. You're going to feel sadness better. You're going to feel disappointment better. You're going to feel joy better. You're going to feel it all way better than you do right now. I'm like, I need to rethink this whole thing. I'm not so sure I'm interested in that. So any other final thoughts or questions? That was a fast 2 hours. It usually tends to be.
Tell us what we can expect tomorrow.
Tomorrow?
Yeah.
That's a good question. Tomorrow, I'm going to, we're going to do a lot more sitting, but I'm going to formulate many of the ideas I said this evening into so what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically look at the Four Noble Truths as 4 different paths of practice. So the theory would be like, well, say I'm interested in, let's just say I wanted to do Buddhist recovery. And I would say, well, if I was doing Buddhist recovery, what would I actually be doing? And so what that would be is what I call the integration of the teachings, or the integrations of the lists. In primary, it's lists of 4. So we'll be looking at thinking about and practicing with the teachings of the Four Noble Truths, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 4 great efforts, the 4 means of accomplishments, the 4 Brahma Viharas, and seeing how those are not lists to memorize, but that I believe, and I don't have much proof to this, but I believe there was a mnemonic device created by the Buddha, because they didn't write anything down, as a way of organizing these into different path practices. So we'll probably get through 3 of them, because the 4th one is kind of hard to practice, because it's the cultivation of the Eightfold Path. So it will be some teaching, but it will be organizing this stuff into kind of a system of training, and seeing how these really actually work together. So you say, okay, well, I know how to do this. So really organizing it into 4 specific practices that you could do every day, you could do in your Dharma practice, that work together as a kind of, so we'll explore that and see how that goes. It's new ideas to me. I'm sort of a fanatic of this stuff, but I have found that that kind of thinking has been helpful for me. What am I supposed to be doing here? And getting a sense for that. So really looking at the original teachings and seeing how they integrate into actually a moment-to-moment cultivation of a practice, rather than just sort of ideas that we need to learn or memorize. So that's what we're going to do tomorrow. So you're all welcome. Some of you are probably already signed up. You can totally come. We'll probably do more sitting. But what I'll do is I'll present the path. We'll practice it. We'll talk about it. I'll present the next path. We'll practice it. We'll talk about it. I'll present the third path. We'll practice it and talk about it, and hopefully get a sense of leaving here like, oh, okay, I can see how this might work, and we'll see if that happens. I think it will. Thanks for asking. That's what we're going to do tomorrow. And so I always like to, part of my practice before we go is if you would feel inclined to join me, you can we'll do what's called a dedication of merit. You can close your eyes and bring your palms together if you feel so. If not, no big deal. We're just taking a moment to reflect inwardly, feeling into your body, your mind, and your heart. And wishing inward and outward that may any goodness that has resulted from our time together, any wisdom or understanding, any kindness, compassion, any sila, any goodness that has resulted in our time together, we dedicate that to the liberation of all beings everywhere. All those suffering with their addiction, all those recovering from their addiction, all those who have died because of their addiction. We dedicate this merit, this goodwill, inward and outward in all directions. And may all people, all living beings everywhere, including ourselves, be free and liberated from suffering in this world. All right. Thank you very much. That was lovely. Thanks for your attention. I really appreciate it.
I have one quick business thing, kind of the spirit of Donna,